Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland, and I'm continuing my video about the Irish oppression myth. Now, not to say that there was never any oppression in Ireland between 1171 and to the present day, but I'm arguing a lot of the time it didn't have much to do with the fact that we're connected to England. It was just the era. That was to say just the Middle Ages, when the aristocracy had virtually all political power and most people had almost none. Where was I? I was talking about the 20th century, how the major gripe of nationalism in the 20th century has been the partition of Ireland. And I pointed out the selective amnesia, how De Valera was twice publicly offered Northern Ireland. Even Unionists were willing to contemplate this, and he turned it down flat. And the partition of Ireland, of course, is something, which was agreed several times over by the Home Rule Party as a temporary measure. They were the Nationalist Party at the time. Then in December 1921, signed by a Sinn Fein delegation in London. Sinn Fein these days don't like to remember that. Then it was put to Dáil Éireann, which was the Irish Parliament, every single member of which was a Sinn Feiner. Now, I know Unionists could have gone, chose not to, but nevertheless it was passed entirely by Sinn Feiners, narrowly, admittedly. Then an election upheld that agreement about partition, an election in the south. Of course, a clear majority in the north wanted partition. So partition was extraordinarily popular. What percentage of Irish people voted for partition? It would have been something like 85% voted for partition. I know they often didn't want it ideally, but they did agree to it in the circumstances. So again and again, south of Ireland, when we were offered some Northern Territory in 1925, again we refused because we preferred to have some of our debt written off. Let me see. So there were bad monarchs in the past. Let's say Henry VIII, a horrific King of England and King of Ireland, estimated to have killed over 100,000 people in England, killed very few in Ireland. There was a rebellion against him in Ireland, but not for separatist reasons. And that's another misapprehension that many people label under. If there's an insurrection, they assume it must be for nationalistic reasons, and that's not always the case. There were lots of rebellions in England in the 16th century. None of them were separatist either. So Henry VIII was a bloody tyrant, despite his merry monarch image. And that was just him. It's not because he's being anti-Irish. Had we been completely separate, do we know things would have been better? We wouldn't have had bad monarchs sometimes? I don't think so. Then there's this fallacy that prior to 1171 was a golden age. Now, I know we're an island of saints and scholars, and you can read that book, How the Irish Saved Civilization. We had many magnificent accomplishments. We had people like St. Garland going all the way to Switzerland, spreading the gospel there. But there was also internecine warfare. We had slavery. We didn't have much in terms of architecture, things like that. Another point that people often overlook is we were a semi-nomadic people right up into the 17th century. Yes, we did have some towns, mostly Danish foundations, but we're wandering around a lot because Ireland's not so suitable for arable farming. Yes, a sedentary lifestyle is possible, and certainly in the eastern part of the country where cereal crops grow quite well, but in the rest of the country people are often following their herds of cattle and sheep. Let me see, so where were we? Talking about the partition of Ireland. Forgive me for jumping back and forward quite a bit. 1921, when the major portion of Ireland split from the United Kingdom, there had been no anti-Catholic legislation on the statute book for a long time. And I talked about the Act to prevent the further growth of popery, which was there in the 18th century and passed by our Parliament. Now, it's true the people in our Parliament were mostly descended from English immigrants a few generations prior to that, but they can still be regarded as Irishmen and did indeed call themselves Irish. Again, that's something people very often overlook. Right up until the end of the 17th century, there was a large community on the east coast of Ireland who were called Old English. Their ancestors come from England and Wales in the 12th century, and they were seen by themselves and everyone else as being English, and they were Catholic. Again, this has undergone erasure. Most people don't realise that. Like Cromwell's massacre at Drogheda, almost everybody he killed that day was English, not Irish. And then it's presented as being a massacre of the Irish by him. It's part of the English Civil War, an intra-English Civil War. Admittedly, we did weigh in on this war. It shows how connected England and Ireland were, that we were involved in the same civil wars, that two kings of England were crowned in Ireland, one in Dublin, one in Cork, and so on, that the Battle of the Boyne, two men who were claimed to be King of England and King of Ireland fought there. I could speculate another time what would have happened had the Battle of the Boyne gone the other way. So that act to prevent the further growth of popery was also trying to say that Catholic priests had to have special permission to be in Ireland because people worried they were going to be recruiting sergeants for the Jacobite cause. And that's another thing. It emphasises how Irish separatism didn't exist in the early 18th century. Nobody seemed to question that the King of Ireland would also be the King of England. So there was this dispute as should our monarch be William III or should it be James II? Obviously, when they died, the heirs of either one of them. And Catholics tended to favour the Jacobites, James II's descendants, because they were Catholics. Let me see. So they talk about English people who came to Ireland and did ghastly things. Who are the descendants of these English people today? They are now called Irish because their descendants have lived in Ireland. So that's us. And again, people try and wipe this from their memory. That virtually everybody in Ireland has English, Welsh and Scots ancestors. It's some of our ancestors doing something bad to others of our ancestors. Let me see. So through the 18th century, about 20% of the Irish population was Protestant. Almost all the rest of us were Catholics. And the Protestant minority lived on the East Coast mainly. Dublin was a mostly Protestant city. They were a well-armed population. Let me see. The Catholic community, we had very little land. We're quite a poor community, partly because our aristocracy had fled. 1607, the flight of the Earls, and then after the siege of Limerick, the remainder of our aristocracy going. So in those days, people expected leaders to come from the landowning classes, and that's why we were poor. Often property sequestered as a result of backing the losing side in this dynastic conflict. People who backed James II had their land taken away from them. So the Catholic majority, we were leaderless in that sense. So talking about our poverty is really because our propertied classes had fled. Let me see. So that the Williamite Wars in Ireland, 1688 to 1691, were not that bloody considering. Obviously there were battles, but were there any massacres of civilians? At that time, I don't know of any. Go back to the 1640s, there were. So for the 17th century, it was a remarkably humane war, quite a clean fight. Bear in mind the 30 Years' War in Germany had gone on not long before, in which millions of people had been killed. And when I say that, I mean millions, about a third of the population of Germany killed in that conflict. So most people were illiterate in the 18th century, not just in Ireland, in every country. And that's one of the reasons why most people were not granted the right to vote, and obviously priests had an important role. And there was all these stories about priests being persecuted and so on, and mass being forbidden. There were mass rocks, partly because the church buildings from the 16th century had been taken by the Church of Ireland. That's the Protestant church. When it was established, they owned the buildings, the Catholic Church did not. I know in the 17th century, the Catholic Church got all of them back, but were to lose them again. But the idea that we really couldn't hear Mass, I think, is ridiculous. That 80% of the population on Sunday hears Mass, and the other 20% have no idea where they are. Meeting of mass rocks, okay, sometimes there were priests who were in Ireland illegally, but sometimes it was simply because we didn't have a building for a while until one was built, and generally we were poor. It was not the aristocracy donating money for the construction of a church, and that's what the Church of Ireland had, the Protestant minority church. Let me see, and higher education, well, I suppose Catholics, we'd had to go to France and so on to be educated there. Trinity College Dublin was the only university in Ireland, and that was a Protestant-only one. Certainly by the late 18th century, Catholics were allowed to go there and did. Let me see. So there were lots of Catholic schools in Ireland in the 18th century, not just hedge schools, real schools. Again, it belies this fallacy that we were not permitted education in Ireland at the time. Okay, we didn't have a university, which was exclusively ours. You do bear in mind that almost nobody went to university in those days, under 1% of the population in any country. And obviously you can forget about women accessing higher education back then. So the notion that we were forbidden to have education is bogus, because that law had fallen into abeyance by the late 18th century. There's this Irish adage, never trust the bite of a dog, the kick of an ass, or the word of an Englishman. Anglophobic. Is that not racist? So there's certainly Anglophobia in Ireland, as indeed there was Hibernophobia in England. But I think certainly anti-Irish sentiment in England has disappeared a long time ago. It's several years since I ever heard anyone say anything mildly anti-Irish in England. Anyway, that's enough for this video.